So since we covered Bluey adults being parents, why don't we talk about their relationship, since that's something we haven't actually touched upon yet. Also, I don't think this ever gets brought up, like which relationship is healthy, at least, and which one is easily the healthiest of the bunch, which you should probably know the answer to. Now before we start, we are going to have to go through a few rules. First of all, this does not include any friendships or anything like such that have somewhat of a romantic feel. We're talking about the parents. Or at least we're just going to talk about the adults. Secondly, we're not going to include any parents on this list who are single, such as Missy's mom, for example, but unless they've been with another parent romantically, like Cornelius with the Terrier's mom, they do still count for this list. And sorry, but we're not going to include literally every single character. Not only would most of them not really have a lot to talk about, but we're mainly going to focus on the actual couples here, and that's at least the bottom line. And also, by the way, there aren't any relationships we would call toxic or even neutral, so these are all perfectly healthy relationships. So we're going to start things off with the least healthy relationship and work our way up to the most healthy. And starting off at the very bottom of the list is going to be a bit of a surprise, but we have Frank and his wife, or as you may know them as Chloe's parents. While they're both definitely good parents to their kids, we don't really have any information to work on them as a couple. They don't really seem to have anything negative to talk about, but we sadly cannot place them any higher for, no kidding, not having a lot to talk about. But why is this being counted as a healthy relationship and not the perfect fit for the gray area? Well, think about it for a second. Frank and his wife do genuinely love their kids, and they do seem to be good parents for the most part, and that's literally all the information we have. Again, there's nothing negative that would drop this into the gray area or even the toxic section, but it's just a lack of information to work with. That's it. Quick spoiler alert, this is going to happen for the next upcoming two relationships, because up next are Jack's parents. Kind of like Frank and his wife, there's not really a lot of information to talk about, but they do seem to generally care about one another for the most part. Even though we do see them in 2 to 3 episodes, they're not usually seen together, which isn't obviously a bad sign. I mean, hey, the Explorers episode had Jack's dad trying to find Jack. And Jack's mom only made 1 appearance. That's kind of disappointing. But we're willing to give this just a tiny bit better of a ranking because unlike Frank and his wife, there's nothing else really to talk about. Moving on. We now get to Coco's parents, or you may know them as Bella and her husband. These two have a little bit more to talk about, because for the most part, they seem to be a perfectly fine couple, even though we never actually get to see her husband. But still though, from what we do know, in the Baby Race episode when Bella starts to talk with Chilli, we actually do get to see that photo of her and her husband with the 9 kids that they actually have, including Coco. That's honestly surprising, but they at least love each other to the point where they would have a lot of kids. That's something nice at least. But again, it's ranked this low because there's not a lot to talk about, not because there's anything negative. For the first and only 2 non-parents on this list, we're going to place Chippy and Cherry here. Now, these two, including Sparky, only appear in 1 episode, so we have this episode to work with. At the beginning of the episode where we see Cherry drop off Chippy so that way he and Sparky can work on the fish pond, we see Cherry being pretty annoyed, but during the episode, we see Chippy constantly trying to talk on the phone with her, instead of doing his job. But anyway, at the end of the episode, the two of them are seen pretty happy with one another, but for most of the episode, it's just kind of there. But there was at one point a bit of negativity, so we're going to place this relationship a bit lower than some people would expect. But it still is pretty healthy nonetheless. So you know how we talked about Cornelius and the Terrier's mom as a good example of who to be on this list? Well, they're actually going to rank here. Now, this is a pretty new relationship, and we only get to see them twice together, but it's still pretty interesting to talk about. We mainly just see them talking for a quick scene in a TV shop episode, and in The Sign for one moment where they actually seem to move in with each other, with Cornelius even comforting her. Otherwise, there's not a lot to talk about. We're gonna move on. Next up are Mackenzie's parents. Now, there is genuine love between these two, but we don't really get to see it with one another that much. In Curry Quest, both of them are together, which is nice, but for some other episodes where they're with a bunch of other people, that's really all we could say in terms of them being with one another. There's nothing negative we could say here, but hey, this deserves at least a bit more of a higher ranking, because they have more screen time to actually work with, so that's nice. Next up are Honey's parents, Daisy and Marcus. Now for these two in particular, we only see them twice together. That's in Spy Game and in a short online. Now yes, Marcus does appear for a brief moment in the archaeology short, but we're not counting that since it's only him and not his wife. Anyway, for the most part, these two seem to be a pretty nice couple. They seem to be happy with one another. And no kidding, that's really all we could say. We now get to the first relationship of the three Healer brothers, starting off with Rad and Frisky. For the two appearances before the sign, they seem to be perfectly happy with one another, and we wouldn't really have anything negative to talk about, but it's the sign that drops this relationship pretty low on the list. Now yes, both of them did get married, but there were some negatives before they even got married, and that's really why this drops low. Other than that, there really isn't anything negative we could talk about, since these two genuinely belong with one another, and that's why it gets placed pretty high up on the list, but again, does lose points for all the negativity that we actually had to mention. Ranking slightly higher are Stripe and Trixie. Kind of like the previous two, these two are a genuine couple with one another, and yes, we could take away a few points for Facey Talk and that one moment in the sign, but we're kind of going to let those slide. For the sign in particular, Stripe wasn't exactly feeling himself. No, I am not saying he's drunk. And as for Facey Talk, both of them did make up. Other than those two questionable negatives, this still ranks pretty higher because we actually see these two a bit more than Rad and Frisky. And also, there's not a lot of negatives that would place us lower. We are now entering the top 5 with Pat and Shanelle. To be honest, this relationship should be a little bit lower because there's not a lot to work with since we only see these two a few times, but we're still going to rank this pretty high up on our list. Plus, these 4 upcoming relationships have almost nothing negative in the slightest to talk about. Now, we only see Pat and Shanelle together in Pass the Parcel and in a Decider. For the Decider in particular, that's kind of the main reason why we're placing it pretty high up on our list. Because both Pat and Shanelle near the end of the episode, when Chucky didn't know which team to decide, both of them reassured him that they didn't really care which team he would support and they would probably support him as much. Well, sure, this would place them pretty high up as parents, but why as a couple? It's actually because both Pat and Shanelle were supporting different teams. And both of them telling Chucky that they didn't care which team to support is actually a really nice and wholesome thing to come from these two. Other than this, the only time we see them argue was over a game and Pass the Parcel, but otherwise it wasn't about their relationship. So honestly, despite everything we talked about, this relationship deserves to be in the top 5. And next up, just outside the top 3, are Rusty's parents. While we honestly don't have a lot to talk about because for the most part, Rusty's dad is in the army, and that's understandable for why we don't get to see him that much, while Rusty's mom would take care of her kids. You know, we're actually ranking this relationship high because of the cricket episode, where both parents exchanged letters. While the family did get Rusty's dad letters saying how he actually missed his family and wished he could come back, there is also genuine love between these two as well. I mean, hey, they had 3 kids after all. Which I know doesn't really prove a point, but think about it for a second. These two have been together for quite a long time, have had 3 kids with one another while one of them is in the military, while the mom keeps an eye out on the kids. And both parents do miss each other. That's more than enough to rank high on the list, but we sadly can't place them in the top 3 for also not really having a lot to talk about. But again, it is understandable since for Rusty's dad in particular, he's in the army. It makes sense. Anyway, we're now entering the top 3, and our bronze medal for the healthiest relationship is gonna be a bit of an interesting choice, but we have Chris and Bob next. Honestly, it might be surprising to rank these two all the way up here, but hear us out for a moment. Both of these parents have nothing negative in terms of their relationship. While Chris isn't really a good mom and Bob is more or less questionable, but isn't that bad, both of them are actually quite great together as a couple. Now, if you don't believe that statement, then look at these 2 episodes in particular. Blocks from the Bluey minisodes and Granny's from, well, the actual episode. Now, Granny's is pretty simple to understand, just Bluey and Bingo trying to teach Bob and Chris how to floss, while both of them enjoying each other's company. It's Blocks that carries this relationship all the way up here. Well, half of the reason at least. Anyway, in that episode, we actually see Chris keeping her promise to keep the block tower that Bluey and Bingo made up until the Sunday, so that way they can come over. While both of them were pretty annoyed and Bob accidentally knocks it all down, they actually rebuilt it, spending even more time with one another. And when the girls actually do come over on Sunday and Bingo accidentally knocks it over again, both of them were willing to help Bluey and Bingo out. That does prove that these two are genuinely loving with one another. Even though they're questionable as parents, when it comes to their romantic relationship, these two are surprisingly great with one another. Taking the silver medal for the healthiest relationship goes to Mort and his wife, or you may know them as Chilli's parents. Now, for Chilli's mom in particular, we only see her for a brief moment in Dragon, but this relationship is surprisingly tragic. Because these two, for the most part, we're mainly going to assume we're actually nice towards one another and actually genuinely enjoyed each other's company and actually genuinely loved one another. What places this relationship very high, close to the top on our list, is because of 2 reasons. First of all, they're both excellent parents with one another, as far as we can assume. If this was something like Fairy Tale, where we actually saw them younger with a young Chilli and Brandy, then we could give them an extra point or 2. But still though, this doesn't take away anything negative in the slightest. Also, Mort does genuinely miss his wife a lot, and that's very understandable coming from a man who not only had probably the best love life, but the best parenting life as well. Well, except the top spot, obviously. This relationship is not only very healthy, but it is extremely tragic as well, and for Mort, we can't help but feel really sorry for you. We hope you're doing alright. But anyway, with all that being said, this deserves to be close at the top of the list. But it is obviously outclassed. You all obviously know who should take the gold medal for the healthiest relationship. I mean, come on, it's Chilli and Bandit. Who else wouldn't take the top spot? While honestly, Mort and his wife could have deserved the gold medal, I mean, come on, Chilli and Bandit have shown us more than enough to place us at the top of the list. There isn't really anything else to show how much these two care about one another. Like, what can we even talk about this? Have you seen a fair amount of episodes where both of them have genuinely cared about one another, comforted one another during tough times, and enjoy each other's company when they're not looking after their kids? Okay, to bring up one of the nearly 200 examples, based on episodes that actually have them, we're mainly going to focus on Fancy Restaurant. In one example where Bluey and Bingo make a quote-unquote special meal, at one point it was supposed to be for Chilli, but Bandit decides to swap in, showing how much he would take a risk for her. And while sure, at the end of the episode he did puke from eating all of it, it showed how much he cared. Honestly, there's not a lot to talk about because there are so many episodes to prove how much these two belong with one another. Look at Fairy Tale. Look at any other episode where they're adults. Just look at every episode where they're together and tell us they deserve nothing but the top spot on the list for the healthiest relationship in the entire series.